Welcome to Season 5 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 4, we'll be talking with Nicki Lees about making the invisible visible. Nicki is a special counsel in the social justice practice at Maurice Blackburn Lawyers in Melbourne, Australia. Over the past 8 years, she has run litigation challenging the legality of the detention of children and the wider conditions that refugees are held in within detention centers. She has also led cases regarding the protection of First Nations rights. Nicki was involved in the creation of Exhibit AI, a project collating dozens of witness statements of life in Australia's offshore processing centers for refugees. In partnership with the witnesses themselves, these statements were fed into AI technology to generate images of life in the regional processing centers on Nauru and Manus Island. Nicki holds a master's in international law with distinction from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Nicki is the chair of the Australian Lawyers Alliance Human Rights Committee and an advisory council member of the Stateless Children Australia Network. Could we start with you telling us a little bit about the project Exhibit AI?
So Exhibit AI, I know, is pretty different to what you usually talk about on your podcast, but I'm really excited to be able to share with you a bit about what it was, some of the ethical questions we had to grapple with, and also how we worked with people with lived experience to put the project together. So basically, our project came out of a legal case that we were running called DBE 17. Now, this case centred on Australia's treatment of refugees on Nauru and Manus Island, which were the two countries that Australia sent their refugees to. What eventually happened was that the law didn't prove to be a useful vehicle to get accountability for these individuals. And the case that we brought ultimately didn't succeed. So we then went back to the drawing board and said, okay, the legal system failed. How else can we get accountability for the human rights abuses that happened? And we can go into more of this in our chat, but in a nutshell, we set up a working group with individuals and said, how would you like your stories shared? They came back to us and said, we want to use images. Images transcend cultural, social, geographical, language differences. And then we came up with the idea of taking our clients' stories through what was submitted to the court in our court case, so our witness statements, pushing them through AI, so through Midjourney, and then basically that created AI images of our clients' lived experiences on Nauru and Manus, and that became Exhibit AI.
So that's, I think, a really interesting sort of starting point, right? The sort of the failure of the legal system is really what led you to this project. And I think that's a really interesting pathway that we haven't really heard very much about before. And I guess I also feel like it begs the question, why AI, right? But of course, you couldn't take photographs on Nauru. Is that correct? Or could you speak to that a little bit?
I think that's a really important point with this project, that photographers were banned. You couldn't get video material in. Basically, there was no other way of getting our clients' stories out. So in that particular situation, we thought, okay, how can we use AI to tell our clients' stories? The other relevant thing is that this is a really vulnerable cohort that didn't want to put their face out to the world. So for them, the idea that they could use AI to remain anonymous but still tell their story was really powerful. So a tagline that we used for the project was making the invisible visible. So just to give you an example of that, at one point, Nauru brought in a $15,000 fee for a journalist to go to Nauru. I myself applied to go to Nauru and got my visa application rejected because I was a lawyer. So we were operating, and these refugees were living in a really difficult situation and a really impossible way to get their stories out in other ways. And it's in that vacuum that we thought, okay, how can AI help us fill that space?
And I think it's really interesting to know more about that process as well. Like, what did that process look like of actually making the images? For example, you know, you were talking about putting their stories through an AI image generator. So did you use their actual testimony, or did you convert that into a prompt? And then I know that process was also very iterative. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think if I take a step back and start with the consultation process with the refugees, actually. So what we did is we had a group of 5 people with lived experience, and we said, how do you want your story to be told? We are here to share your story in a way that feels authentic and consultative and appropriate for what you want the world to know. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of using images came through really strongly, but again, we didn't have the actual photos to be able to do that. So we had this really unique situation where we had spent over 300 hours collecting individual testimony. That was myself and a couple of colleagues that we spent over 2 years interviewing 100 plus individuals to get their day-to-day experiences on Nauru and Manus. We then created 60 witness statements that we filed with the court, and they were really detailed. Some of them were over 20 pages long. And the unique thing about this evidence was that it wasn't just high level, it was really iterative, and it really went into the day-to-day experiences. What were the showers like? What were the tents like? How did people eat? What did they have to wait in line to eat? So then what we had is this really comprehensive blow-by-blow experience of what a day looks like on Nauru or Manus. We then partnered with a creative agency. So we took our experience as lawyers and then created a partnership with How Watson & Co., which is an Australian creative agency. And we said to them, how can we bring life through this project to our clients' stories? So they had an AI technician that works with them, and they fed the entire witness statement, sometimes up to 20 pages into Midjourney. What then happened is 50 to 60 images were generated. And then we had these multiple products of what our client's testimony looked like for AI images. What we then did is had another consultation process with the refugees themselves. So from the very start, we tried to lay some ground rules in that this is a really difficult project and you only have to be involved insofar as you feel comfortable. If you would like to review the AI images, you're completely welcome to do so. If you don't want to see them ever again, one of the refugees put their hands up and said, we're happy to review their images for them because we know what it was like. So it was a really collaborative process from everyone. What we found out of the 35 individuals who wanted to be part of the whole project, 30 said they were happy to review their images. So we had a trained psychologist available for them to debrief with after looking at the images, and we tried to do it in a really trauma-informed and respectful way. So we had a mix. Some individuals were in the US, they've been relocated to Europe, to New Zealand. Those people reviewed the images online or virtually. Then we also had a working day. So we flew about 5 or 6 refugees to Melbourne, and we sat down with them and the AI technician, and we just went through in absolute detail if the AI images matched their recollection of Nauru or Manus. And a couple of the refugees spent hours working with the AI technician and saying, look, the trees were a bit different. The tents looked a bit different. And so after 6-7 hours of this process, the program was trained to actually understand what we wanted it to do more. The images were a lot closer to the lived experience on Nauru or Manus. And then what we did is we had up to 3 or 4 times back and forth between the refugees saying, I see this image, but actually there was one more guard there. And we had that back and forth consultation process until we had complete sign off from the refugees that these images represent, to the best of my recollection, what Nauru and Manus was like.
That's super interesting. And had you done this process, like that kind of collaborative process before with photographs, or was this your first time, or the law firm's first time doing this kind of process? Or, how did you develop, I guess, that sort of very collaborative, iterative process for this project?
It was a massive learning curve for us in terms of the images and AI and thinking through the ethics of using AI and how we were going to approach this, and particularly in the vacuum where photographers weren't allowed and there were no images available. I've been involved in public interest litigation for 8 or 9 years. And so the idea of centering those with lived experience or centering those who are affected by a project is something that we've realised the importance of for a long time. In our client cases, you always have to be amplifying the voice of those affected and not, the lawyer's voice or the judge's voice or other people in the legal system. That idea that people with lived experience need to be front and center of every project is quite innate to us at this point. And we really wanted to represent that through the idea of images and this project too. And I think that actually brings up a really important point around the aim of the project. So when we sat down with people and we said, what do you want to achieve from this? There was really three aims that they had. The first was, we want not just the Australian public, but we want the whole world to know what happened to us. We want this to be a public education piece. We want people to see the images, get engaged, read the stories behind them, and then understand the human rights abuses that we had to live through. The second thing they wanted was for politicians to see the images, be engaged, again, read their stories and change policy. But the third thing they wanted, I think, is really interesting, which is a healing process. So they wanted to have these images out there as a type of restorative justice or accountability that they felt they could start to move on from the experience because they'd shared their story. And so the idea that they were really involved in the process and that they felt empowered and they felt that they were leading the whole process was incredibly central to that third pillar. And the feedback was that they did feel like that. But I mean, obviously, it's such a long healing process. But, as smaller part as it is, it was really important to us that this had that healing aspect to it.
That's super interesting as well. So did you actually have an opportunity sort of for them to, feedback about the process at the end? And what kinds of things did you learn from that?
Yeah, so I made sure that I spoke to every single person after the process finished and asked if they had any feedback for us. One woman that really springs to mind is someone that is profiled in the project. She had a really horrific experience on Nauru and she was sexually assaulted, and she had never disclosed it to anyone before this case and this project. So we worked together really closely on how she wanted to frame her narrative and how she wanted to tell her story and how she wanted the images to look like for such a personal experience. So we worked together for over 6 months on how she wanted her images to look like and her story. And so many of those calls ended in tears and, let's not talk anymore today and pick it up tomorrow. And are you sure you want to do this? And that trust that she showed in us to be able to let us do that was so humbling. And I just remember at the end of the project, I called her and she just said, "Oh, Nicki, I'm so proud of myself." So she said the images were really hard to look at, but I'm so proud of myself that I created them. And so the fact that for her, AI was able to assist with that she could tell her story to the lawyers. We could use AI to bring that to life in the most, ethical way that we could. And then she had that product as such, or that image to show other people or to be proud of herself, was really important. Another lady in the US at the end of the project, I said to her, "Oh, what was your experience or what was the value of this?" And she said to me that people in the US don't understand what we went through. And so, it's one thing to have this court statement, but no one's going to sit down and read this court statement for 2 hours. So what she's been doing is actually showing people the images. And she said that out of anything she's ever told them and all the conversations she's had in the US, it's the images that cut through and people say, "Oh, I didn't get it until you showed me that. I didn't get what you meant around the tents being moldy or the food being moldy." So she said that she's been able to actually articulate her experience as a refugee so much easier through having these images to accompany her conversations. So I think those kind of feedbacks have been really powerful. Look, at the end of the day, people also say, has policy been changed? What's happening? And for us, it's about creating an archive of truth-telling as well, so that 10 years' time, if people want to say, "Oh, we didn't know what the conditions were like," we can say, "Well, we had these images, we had these stories. They were in a book, they were on a website. We went to Canberra and we gave them to politicians." Part of this is that people realise that this is a long-term evidence collection process.
A phrase that really sticks in my mind here that you've just used is an archive of truth-telling. And I think that probably sticks for a lot of reasons. One reason would be that I did my PhD on looking at photography archives of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So, when you look at sort of photography archives of conflicts like that, like they're invoked and have been invoked in trials, and they're invoked in testimony, and the way that people also think about their past. There's a real popular use of archival photographs like online. And I wonder, what does that do if images that we're referring to as an archive are AI generated?
It's such a big question, and it's something that we were really conscious of grappling with, but also found it really difficult to grapple with, because it is different, the project that we were doing. We were trying to bridge that gap between fact and images, and they are AI generated. So it is an inherent conflict. I think how we approached it and how we satisfied ourselves in terms of that sort of ethical conflict was that there weren't cameras there and that you couldn't get cameras in. So we were filling a vacuum, that if we didn't do this, the court statements would have been archived and never seen the light of day. So it's not like we're coming in over a space where there was an opportunity to do that. Second, we were very clear in making sure that they weren't mistaken for real photographs. So everything about the project is being really transparent about the fact that they are AI images. An interesting example was we had so many different drafts of the Midjourney images that we worked through with clients and with rights holders. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was that one of the drafts looked really realistic, and you could not tell if they were a photo or reality. And the feedback that we went back to the agency on was, please make them a little less realistic, because we wanted to mitigate that exact risk that people would say, oh, this is 100% reality. And what we're saying is, these are our clients' recollections and these are our client stories. And the idea and the philosophy of the project is that the images act as a vessel or a vehicle into the testimony. So on the website, you have the images, then the stories attached. In the exhibitions that we've done, you have the images, but billboards with the stories. In the book, the image is always with the story. So we try to seek that validity, I guess, on being really transparent, making sure that they're clearly labelled AI generated, that they don't look 100% realistic, and that they're always attached to the story. And then we try to accompany it with the information that, look, this was over 300 hours of evidence collected by lawyers. It wasn't tested in court to a final outcome, but it was really thoroughly collected and tested by lawyers themselves in putting it together. So I think for us, in being really transparent about the limitations of the project and trying to link it with the stories and making sure that the images don't look 100% real and are constantly labelled AI, that's how we tried to traverse some of those ethical conflicts.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you maybe give an example or talk about some of the other ethical challenges that you faced in creating this project? Because I'm sure there were many.
There were at every turn, different questions to grapple with. One of the really interesting things, and look, I think it was an ethical question, is how different backgrounds or minorities are represented through AI technology. So, for example, when we were putting together part of this project, it was when the protests were going on in Iran, particularly around the idea of women having the freedom not to wear a hijab or a head covering. And interestingly, when we put all the statements from Iranian women through Midjourney, every single woman was wearing a hijab. And that actually caused some distress for our clients, who were very, very politically outspoken around their choice to wear a head covering or not in Iran. And so when Midjourney pushed out that first round of images, we had to do a lot of work with the Iranian women of saying, okay, well, what's the political context here? And it's actually really offensive if you just suddenly start putting head coverings on or not putting them on. And so that actually took a lot of traversing and conversations about how they want to be represented in individual circumstances. And I thought that was actually really fascinating. And we got to a point where people were happy with how they were represented, but you definitely saw that AI didn't have that nuance, and the AI stereotyped particular individuals and women and cohorts and different minorities. We saw that with other examples as well. For example, there were a lot of different Rohingya individuals, and the way they were represented wasn't particularly culturally sensitive. And yeah, so look, that issue of how AI represents minorities kept coming up for us. And I think that's a wider conversation around AI that's happening as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's a massive issue. And I've read some quite interesting articles about that, which I'll link in the show notes, because I think it's a real theme and a real challenge that comes with using AI.
I think another ethical consideration was, and this is something that I always think about too. What do people owe us in terms of telling their story, and what burden do we put on people that have been through experiences to share their trauma or their pain? And it's really tough because we consulted and we want to do the right thing, and it's led by people with lived experience. But when we did the exhibition, individuals walked in and they burst into tears at the sight of the images. And I felt really conflicted in that situation because, yes, we're trying to do the right thing and achieve some sense of accountability and justice, but are we re-traumatizing individuals at the same time? And all we could do was be really, again, open and transparent and say to these individuals, this is your choice, you're leading the process. We had a room at the exhibition set aside for people that just needed some time out from not seeing the images. And we just tried to sort of, I guess, keep the process as open as possible. And some people dropped out as they went through because it was too much. And as I said before, we had a psychologist that was there for debriefing if people wanted to, as they were creating the images. So look, that one of those things, it's always tough, I think, with that question to struggle with. But we, at the end of the day, we had to be led by what the clients felt like they could do and how they wanted to present the project.
No, that brings up, I think, another really important question that I have is what were the outputs? So you discussed an exhibition. I think there was also a book. Were there other outputs?
So the main thing was a website that we wanted to be evergreen content that is www.exhibitai.com, which people can go to and look. And there's the images. There's a short video that explains some of the way that the project was put together. And then there's the witness testimonies. We launched the website at a exhibition in Melbourne at the Immigration Museum. And then we created a book to go with it too. There was also a big photo op done at Parliament House that politicians had to walk past, where it was the images done up in a really large scale. I think then we're looking at future avenues for how to continue the interest, because there's been a lot of interest in the project, and actually it just keeps growing internationally in terms of the issues that are raised and the technology that we used.
Absolutely. And at the exhibition, I think it's always interesting to think about, how, especially you were describing like people going through this exhibition and having quite emotive reactions to it. How were the images presented in that space? Were they very large? Were they very small? Like, and how did you sort of make those decisions?
We had the consultation group of 5 refugees that we ran everything by. One of the ideas they came up with was to have the images blown up to a really large size. And one side was the image and the other side was their story. They then asked that the audience or the attendees of the exhibition get a sense of what their experience was behind barbed wire. So they asked us to set up a barbed wire perimeter around all the images. That was really intense. It was really visually confronting, but it was aimed to create, I guess, exactly that confrontation, that feeling. So that's how, we set it up. I think one interesting thing to note around the exhibition launch was the media interest and the hesitations around AI that we experienced at the start of that. So basically, we put out a call to journalists and said, look, we're launching this project, uses AI images of refugees' experiences. It's never been done before. Do you want to come along? And there were crickets. The feedback we got from media agencies at the time was, look, we don't know about this AI technology. It's really new. We don't really want to engage in the project because we're really worried about printing the images and people think that they're real. Interestingly, the international media picked it up first. So we had, CNN, and we had different international media outlets that said, this is a really interesting way to use AI technology to convey lived experiences of people where cameras aren't available. Once the international media picked it up, the Australian media then said, oh, wait, we're interested too. And so we had multiple articles running about this project. But there was that really interesting initial hesitation of we don't quite know how to deal with AI images yet.
I guess I wanted to know also about like your experience as a lawyer, coming into this project. And I have some sort of technical questions as well about like Midjourney, but I don't know if you would be best placed to answer those questions. But some of those questions are, I guess, also kind of legal. This is kind of a two-part question. So I'm interested in your experience about approaching this sort of visual project as a lawyer, but I'm also interested in, the legality or the legal implications of using a tool like Midjourney for, feeding these testimonies, and like what are the data considerations for that?
So we did a lot of looking into that and sourced a legal advice before we commenced the project. We looked at it from a couple of different angles. So one, once we upload our witness testimonies, do we lose any ownership of them? Are there any other ethical considerations, or are there any other legal considerations that we have to think about in regards to that? At the end of the day, we were satisfied that we were sufficiently protected in that sense. We then looked at, well, is there any other legal issues in terms of using the Midjourney images? And where we got to was, again, the overall legal basis was sound for the project. And while there were some different controversial ethical considerations around how Midjourney works, for example, when we balanced those against the idea that if we don't do this, statements are going to be archived after 7 years, destroyed, never seen again. And the idea that the original images that were created were so changed and so individualized towards our clients' own stories. In the end, none of these are issue-free, but we made the call that on the balance of benefit that our project still warranted proceeding with. I think one of the other interesting things in terms of what Midjourney first put out, and then where we got to at the end of the day, was some of the first images that were created was Nauru, which actually for the listeners, I should give some context. So Nauru is an island a few hours off the coast of Australia. It's the size of Melbourne Airport. It's a very, very small island. And it's basically very, very hot environment. But Midjourney put European fir trees all over the island of Nauru, the first images that came out. So look, some of the stuff it did was very bizarre, and it did take a lot of work with the AI technician and individual work from the refugees to come up with images or a product that they were happy with at the end of the day. So what we started with and where we ended up was actually like a very different product that was put out by Midjourney.
Yeah, and I think you said something there that I think is super important, that there wasn't a clear cut or a simple ethical answer, but in the balance of things. And I think that that's a really important point for everybody, not just people who are thinking of using AI, but for anybody who's making visual work, is that there are always going to be ethical considerations that are in tension. And a lot of times the best we can do is to weigh those things up and make a call. And sometimes we'll look back in the future and say, oh, that was the wrong call or that was the right call. But you have to work with the information that you have, I guess, at the minute, and as much information as you can glean. And I think it definitely sounds like all of the time and effort that you put into looking at the different models and looking at the data protection challenges, that's a lot of learning to put in. So I think that that's really commendable. Do you have any advice for anyone who would want to start a project using AI, maybe on a similar topic, maybe on a different topic, but what things should they be thinking about? What things should they watch out for?
Definitely. So this process took years to put together, between talking to individuals, between coming up with the idea to use AI. And AI has developed so much since we did the project. It's going leaps and bounds forward. I've had a look at other projects that use people's lived experience or human rights abuses, and then putting an AI lens on them to share the story. I think what I'm really proud of with our project is the fact that it was so that the people who are affected were at the center of the project. So the fact that we had the working group of people that advised on every part of the project. And look, sometimes they said do things that I didn't think was maybe the best option. But at the end of the day, whose story are you telling? Who are you doing this for? And so occasionally we would have back and forth, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, the project was for them, and they're giving us the honor of sharing their story. So what they wanted went, honestly. And I'm very proud of that. So I think the idea of nothing happens quickly, it's a really slow process. And it's just so important to center the story and have the voice of those affected making the decisions. I think, yeah, it's so easy with a project like Midjourney to just put in prompts or to just say to pick this. And so really thinking about how you frame your project and making sure that there is that distinction between AI and reality. I think as soon as you get into AI generated images that are passed off as real images, it's such a completely inappropriate thing to be doing. And so as much as you can be upfront around what's AI and why it's AI. So I think our tagline of making the invisible visible was the tagline of the project because we wanted people to know that there were no cameras allowed and that this is a particular social function. This is playing a particular social function. So I think that idea of being really clear about why you're using AI is really important, not just because it's a new fun thing to be using, the new sparkly gadget, but what is the purpose of AI? How does it amplify your client's voice? And how does it center the person with lived experience at the center of the project?
I absolutely love what you said about like why are you using AI? Like not just because it's something new. And I think that can happen so easily that we get caught up in the novelty of something, but maybe it isn't actually fit for purpose for the project that we want to do or the intention that we have or our intended impacts or outputs, and I think that's a really, really important point. And I think, like you said, like in this case, photography wasn't an option. Like there are a lot of reasons why you went down the route of AI. And I think being able to articulate that is so important. So just wanted to highlight that that phrase because I think that's really, really key. And then can you maybe tell us a little bit about what the images actually depict?
So all the images focused on a different part of the refugees' day-to-day life on Nauru, which is really interesting because a lot of the narrative around Nauru or Manus Island in Australia was the really high-level stuff. So self-harm, sexual assault, all those types of things. And that's incredibly important, of course. But what was missing in the narrative is what life was like on that day-to-day basis. So what's different about the project and what's shown in the images is things like the tents. So that came up a lot. The fact that the tents were moldy, there was no air conditioning in the tents. So some of the most powerful images are just of a tent with mold in them. And for me as a lawyer who took all these statements, I'd taken those statements time after time after time. And it wasn't until I suddenly saw it in an image that it actually really hit home to me how absolutely dehumanizing it was to make someone live in that condition. For example, another picture was an individual taking a shower in their clothes. And this was another issue that came up all the time, that there was a 2-minute limit on showers. And so refugees would constantly wear their clothes. They didn't have any privacy. There was this time limit, so they'd shower in their clothes. And I think for me as a lawyer, taking the statements, I'd again kind of just not disregarded it, but I hadn't really engaged with that content. And I'd focused again more on some of the sort of physical assaults, etc. But when I saw the image, it again struck me, this is a really, not serious, but it was a real indignity for an individual to have to shower in their clothes and not have privacy. And even though I was immersed in this issue and I took all these statements, the image still brought it home for me in a way that the written word didn't. So even working on this project for years, that idea of looking at something affected me in a way that I didn't expect it to. The image is then raised from littler things to really serious assaults, like sexual assault, physical assaults. And it was a real challenge actually to try to develop an image with the individual that did capture those sexual and physical assaults, and that was a really tough thing to do. And people were incredibly brave in how they sat there and looked at the image and said, oh, I think it was more like this.
Could you tell me a little bit more about what the consent process looked like to making sure, I guess I'm thinking in particular about the risk of re-traumatization in this process. And I'm wondering, like, how did you ensure that people really understood what they were signing up for, and where it was going and things like that?
So when the case ended, we had to call every single person that we'd taken a statement from and tell them that the case had finished. And that was really hard. We'd spent 5 years litigating this case. People had poured their heart out to us, had told us things that hadn't told anyone else in the world. And we had told them, we're going to share your story with the court. So when we had to call them and say, we're really sorry, this is no longer proceeding, it was a really mixed bag of reactions from individuals. The 60 people that myself and 2 colleagues called, we had around 40 of them say to us, if you can do anything else with our stories, please do that. So there was a good third that just said, we never want to be involved in this again, and we've had enough, and we don't want to share our story, and we just want to move on with our lives, which is completely fair enough. Of the 40 that said, if you can come up with a good way to tell our stories, we'll be involved. So what we then did is we sent an email to all those 40 individuals, and we said, who would like to be on a working group to advise us around how you would like your story told? And 5 individuals said, we're willing to take that on for the group. So they came up with this idea of using images, and then we set up a call between the creative agency and our consultation group. The creative agency pitched the idea to that group and said, what do you think about AI? And they had actually a separate call with every single consultation group member and said, this is what the process would look like, and this is what we think it would take and involve from you. So in the end, we had 35 individuals that got an email, and we set out exactly what the process is going to be. And we said, if you'd like a call, we had translators. Obviously, people spoke a whole lot of different languages. So we paid for translators to explain the project to every single person. And then the option that we gave them was, you can choose option A. You want to have your story run through Midjourney, and then you never want to hear from us again. And that's your that's your absolute prerogative. And then you don't want to see any images. Option B is you would like to work with us to look at the images from Midjourney, and then work with us until the finished product. And option C was you want to be an advocate on this project. And we had people that spoke at the exhibition that have met with politicians with us that wanted to even go further and talk to the images to other people. So with the people that said we're happy to review the images, it had to be such a balance for us. So particularly for me, women who had been sexually assaulted were just a category of their own. And that's something that I dealt with those women in a whole different way. And often we didn't show them the images. Every step of the way, I said, do you want to still be involved? How are you feeling? Would you like a psychologist to debrief with? Do you want to continue with this project? And they were so incredible, and they completely surpassed my idea of what they should be doing. And they kept saying, we want to see the images. And so often I would describe what the image was before I called them. So before I sent it to them, I'd give them a call and I'd say, look, Midjourney has created this image. It shows this. Do you want to see it? There's absolutely no expectation that you need to. And almost all the time they said yes, because we lived through this. We don't want to keep this a secret anymore. We want the world to know what happened to us. If that means that I have to look at the image, I'll do it. And they were so inspirational, and they were just these powerhouses of women. And they did it. They gave feedback, and they looked at the images and they said, this is what I want my story to represent. But we tried to just make sure that their consent was achieved at every step of the way. And look, some of them, for example, with the book, we said, we've created a book of all the images. Would you like to receive a copy? Some of them said yes, and some of them said no. Like, we just don't want that in our house. So we tried to just be led by them of how they were comfortable at every step of the way.
And then I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast, what does photography ethics mean to you? But for the purposes of this conversation, I might change that and say, what does visual media ethics mean to you?
I feel like I've been a broken record with saying the same thing, but I mean, honestly, it's whether it's law or visual media, and it's been so interesting how closely these issues have related. It's about putting your client or the person you're representing or the person at the other end of the lens or the person at the other end of the phone call or whatever project you're doing. It's about doing justice to what they want and to honor the fact that they're sharing their story with you or they're giving you their image or whatever it might be, and taking the time to amplify what that is. I think obviously I'm a lawyer, so I can just talk about it from the legal industry as well. But sometimes you see, even in kind of human rights cases, you see lawyers talking about what they want to achieve with a case or being very vocal. And it's actually sometimes we need to take a step back and just give space to people to have their voices heard. And I was really pleasantly surprised how much the same concept translated through Exhibit AI and this project around visual images, and how for us to achieve our three aims in the project, public knowledge, policy change, and then a restorative healing process. We just absolutely couldn't have achieved any of those without having that consultation group, having the individuals put their hands up and say, we'll look at the images, even though they're completely re-traumatizing, and we'll give you some feedback on how they can be better. And we'll say that we verify and validate these images. And the project would have been meaningless without that. And so I would really recommend to anyone else looking at doing this type of thing, or in terms of what is kind of really important at the end of the day, is just having that kind of philosophy and that approach.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Zula Rabakovska on working with communities. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to take the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.